Live from US in progress at the American Film Festival in Poland, I'm speaking with filmmaker Summer Shelton for You and I. This is the location of your international premiere, and this is familiar terrain for you. We'll get back to what Wrocław might mean to you. Before we plunge into your directorial debut, as we know, we're fans of the American indie scene, the burgeoning scene that's happening now, but also the naughts and the everything that transpired before that. So I wanted to get an idea of just like if you had to pause it and then frame what that North Carolina scene looked like from the time that you were just a bit player on All the Real Girls, going up to your first credit with Ramin Bahrani on Goodbye Solo, one of my favorites of his. How does that epoch look like? How do you look back at that juncture, your first beginnings in this business, from that specific location, that specific feel or treatment of Americana?
I think that time period for me, I was in my early mid-20s during that time period, and I think that was my first of I guess we'll discuss a second kind of metamorphosis or change. I had been a high school English teacher, kind of returned home after graduate study, and living in the small town, but I still had these aspirations to tell stories or do something, and I really just didn't know how. I mean, a lot of my acting and theater, being on camera, started because I didn't really know any other way to be involved in films. I thought you were just in them. So part of me going to film school was learning, like, what are these other options? And that's how I met Ramin. And I think by being there and meeting him, and he definitely opened my eyes to like the possibilities and also the community, and having known of David Gordon Green's work and Danny McBride and all the wonderful people that come out of the School of the Arts, that I was just like, wow, okay, that's aspirational, like maybe that's within reach. So I think it's about looking at those, before me, and like seeing that it's something tangible and that they have something to say, and they each have their own unique voice, and people wanted to hear it. And so I think that's, something for me is not being afraid to share your voice and represent a different kind of place, because I come from a very different world. Even from Winston-Salem to Mount Airy, North Carolina, Westfield, where I grew up, it was two very different worlds. So it was nice to feel like, okay, well, maybe I can represent my little part of the South and add to the conversation, and too, as a woman.
And what's inspiring at that specific juncture is all these new voices. They were all new voices. They were all new players finding themselves, exploring narrative with what you're saying, that DNA. So I got to meet you a couple of days ago. We had some great convos about just your backstory, I guess. I was really intrigued by your curiosity at a young age, because you could have had a different outcome, let's say. You could have been a teacher to this day, but you chose differently, and that doesn't come by accident. That comes from choices that you made at a very peculiar age, where I don't want to say it's life-altering choices. So how do you see that? How do you see Summer of in her teens? How do you look back at her and say, okay, well, those were instrumental in me deciding to swerve?
I think for me, I've always maybe felt a bit like an outsider in a lot of ways. I grew up in a very small rural town where it was a very kind of transient community in certain ways, with people coming in maybe for certain jobs and then leaving, textiles and things shutting down, tobacco, all these type of industries that have flourished and would have temporary workers come in. And so my childhood, from kindergarten to high school, I think there was only 7 of us that went from kindergarten to 12th grade together, and the rest was people in and out of my life. And I walked to the bus every morning growing up. So it was like every morning I took a long walk, and I went to the mailbox, and I stood there and I waited for a bus to get me. And I think it was just these little tiny things that kind of add up over life, of like having these little moments of time to reflect and know like there could be what else is out there in the world. I mean, when you grow up in a rural area and you can just look all around and there's kind of endless horizons in some way, you know that there's something else out there. And then also I escaped in television. Like I saw the things on fancy TV, like New York City, the Big Apple was just like going to outer space. Like, what in the world is that fancy, all those lights? And you know, I was in the era of like magazines, and I wanted to work in journalism. Like I wanted to, you know, the new Calvin Klein campaigns and all these cool fashion ads and like stories in Harper's Bazaar. And I'd get all these magazines, go to the library and like get the thick fancy magazines with the pretty colors and kind of look through them and be like, wow, this is just a different world than
fascinating
where I am. So I guess it was a lot of escapism in certain ways, and then still feeling like, you know, you may not really fit in. So I think that was one thing, is even though, you know, I may have on the outside feel like, you know, seemed like I had it all together, I just always felt like I was outsider, or I just that wasn't my place at that moment in time.
So the pandemic made, there was a lot of suffering, there was a lot of grief, but it also gifted us. And I want to say that little voice in your head pushed you into a new direction, because you do come from the film world, you are a producer, but you said, now's my time to tell a story, not necessarily your story, but a story. So talk to me about that lightning bolt moment during the pandemic, what that represented to you, and how did it gestate into you getting to final draft and start putting that out there?
Well, I think sometimes, I mean, for me at least, sometimes when you feel like you have everything to lose, or things are like at the midst of just collapsing, like it's kind of go big or go home, is kind of the moment I kind of felt. I was like, because it is a privilege to be a filmmaker. Even, you know, it's a luxury to be able to tell stories, and I don't take that lightly. And you know, that could change at any day. You're not guaranteed forever, and sustaining myself in the industry has not been easy. It's very difficult. I still teach, so I'm still a teacher. So that's hard. So for me in the pandemic, I was very concerned that like it might be over for me. Like I had had a great track record and such support from great people, Film Independent and give me the Spirit Award. I had 2 films out, and then I was in development, and the pandemic came and kind of squashed a lot of things for a while, and I just didn't know what was the light. And I thought, well, I had wrote on a Post-it, "Don't hold back." That was my mantra in making the film. And I thought, I'm just going to take all the advice that I've given all the filmmakers I've mentored and all the students and apply it and say, you know, kind of practice what you preach. You know, it's kind of the world I come from. So that's what I did. And I wrote something from the heart. I wrote it in a way that I could make it on a small budget with the resources I had. I set my ground rules. And then again, every day in the pandemic I did walks. So walking's kind of like my thing. And I would walk for like 82 minutes every morning. 5 miles-ish. I don't know if that's good or bad, but that was my time. And I would just listen to a lot of music. And I think that's where a lot of things came from. It's just that kind of melancholy feeling. And melancholy is something that's always been present in my life, and something I've studied and thought about and present with me. So it was kind of a moment where, how can I take these things that I'm feeling and communicate them in a way that shows maybe who I am. I mean, I've helped a lot of people uplift their voice.
Yes.
But I really haven't had kind of the moment to like sit back and think, well, who are you? What's your voice? What do you want to say? And I thought this would be the time where I could express myself in that way. So I just wrote what I know, which is something poignant and painful, which seems to be you know, kind of an oscillating thing in the life of an indie filmmaker.
It's a great currency. It makes for great matter. So you're a creative collaborator on this project, producer, actor. I had discovered him in Killing of Two Lovers. And he has such a great face to tell story. Like you can read so many details in his face. From trauma to happiness, it's hard to decipher Mr. Crawford's different layers. And you discovered him through a television series that you had told me about, which I'm still unaware of. First of all, how did you approach him for the role? It's I don't want to say it's a big risk, but it is a weighty role, and he's going into directions or territories that he might not be accustomed to. You're asking a lot from him emotionally, and I want to say, even though the player is not necessarily naked, this is a role that asks him, forces him to be naked, to be raw. So just tell me about the connective dots.
Yeah, so I everything I feel in this journey for me is just kismet, and I just have to like turn it over to the stars and think, for whatever reason, this is the path I'm supposed to be on. So during the pandemic, like many, I was been watching a lot of things. I'd been referred to Rectify from several different places. One of my peers that is also in the film, Linz Edwards, stars in that show, and I was like, I want to watch things that my friends have made, and so I binge watched it, and within the first episodes, I saw this character, Teddy Talbot, and he reminded me of a lot of the young men I grew up with, and I'm like, oh, this person feels familiar, and is so charismatic, but also within like one episode like this, he just turns you from being someone that you're kind of like, oh, to like, you feel for them, they're vulnerable, you want to root for them, and I just thought, who is this actor? And so that's how I knew about him, and at that time, that show was, pretty old, so I like was trying to do the math, I'm like, well, where is he
today?
Yeah, like so I had put together the dots of The Killing of Two Lovers, and that was had been at Sundance not too long from when this inspiration was happening, and the director I reached out to, Robert Machoan, who was kind enough to share the film with me, and I watched it, and most importantly, I watched a press interview he was doing for Killing of Two Lovers, and I was like, okay, here he is now. And he got very emotional just talking about his role as a father and with his family, which is, the most important thing to him. And he got very vulnerable about it. And I'm like, oh, that's all very real. This is a person that feels things. But also, I felt he would connect to the character, knowing that, the character in the story is a father. But also, I just felt like something about him just made me feel safe and felt like at home, and sound of his voice. He's also from the South, so we sound alike. So I think it's just these strange things, and come to find out we have similar backgrounds growing up in rural areas, living on farms and things. So I think it was just a lot of parallels.
Yes.
And so I had connected the dots that Linz knew Clayne, and they actually knew each other a lot more than I thought, and Linz and Ashley Shelton, who's also in the film, was kind enough to help facilitate an introduction. So they reached out to Clayne and said, hey, there's this woman who made these things. I assume Clayne Googled me to see I wasn't like maybe a crazy cake.
Yes.
I had some street credit, and asked if I could send him material. So, I wrote my letter, I put together a package and made my visual boards, because I'm like, this guy's gonna think I'm crazy, because it is a big ask, especially for someone. I've never made a short film.
Wow, yeah, it's true.
Yeah, I don't have anything to show other than the work that I've done with others,
Yes.
which does not necessarily
Exactly.
mimic what I plan to do. So I knew it was a big risk, but I also, I wrote it for him. I wrote it to the cadence of his voice. I was interested in him being in a role where he was at the helm of his fate, rather than roles like in Teddy and in in Killing of Two Lovers. He was responding to people inflicting, trauma or leaving in relationships and things, being the one that is left by someone. So I was like, oh, what is this person like, at the opposite side of the equation? And he does remind me of classic Hollywood. You're right. He has a beautiful face on camera, and he captures so much. And he reminds me of old Hollywood. I was binge watching all those movies, and he reminds me of like Warren Beatty and Trevor Howard and, young Jack Nicholson, and you just see life on his face, and I think that's very special.
Absolutely. I think what I found fascinating about this film is contemplating their backstory. You don't spell it out. You let the audience sort of like tap into what that reality could have been like. I was wondering, you had mentioned during your Q&A that you had very little prep time in a physical location. how much backstory did you write for individual characters, but also their point of views? Did you do intricate details in terms of how they approached or saw their former relationship?
Yeah, I actually, one thing I made in prep that I provided to Clayne that I hope was maybe helpful was I made like a memory book for Sarah and Joseph. Like here's like almost like a scrapbook, which is a common thing in the film, is memories and tokens and keepsake, and I wanted to make something he could hold and touch. And so I made like a memory book where I just like wrote, these are the memories that these two people had together, you know, fictional things, and with pictures that, you know, is kind of the style I wanted of the film. So I provided that, and I think that was helpful. And then, you know, I shared a few things about, you know, from some journal entries of things that I'd written reflecting on relationships and things. I shared with him, you know, just over the phone or in prep, just to give kind of an insight into where I was coming from. But a lot of it, you know, I did want it to be like an onion, to kind of just to peel back, you know, because that's the way your memory works. It's kind of you start one layer and then you keep going back and back and back and back, and let them kind of feel that out with each other. And, you know, that was a fun experience.
I mentioned this to you before. I'm a big fan of the long take. I'm also a fan of how you framed the long take. You sort of like, you let beats exist, you let emotions be varied and complex. What's being said emotionally or physically might be different from what's being spoken. There's a lot of layers here. I also like the fact that there's a sequence where the character is going back and forth between cleaning up the table and going to the kitchen, and you allow the camera, almost like Haneke, I want to say, like there's bits where the characters are not. And I thought that was an interesting sequence where there's a flux, where life exists. And so I just wanted to get an idea of the strategy behind you employing the long take, but also its usefulness in allowing you to enhance the performance, or enhance that connection, or enhance the distance between the characters.
Yeah, I'm a fan of, you know, being an observer. I wanted the audience to experience the film the way the characters would remember it. And I knew going in that I wanted the end to be in close-ups, which is a very kind of emotional moment. And I wanted that to be impactful. So really, in my mind, sometimes the only way one thing works is if you hold back from it from a long time, which is kind of parallel to these people's relationship. They've been holding back from each other from so long. So I wanted the camera to do that as well. And I wanted, you know, I come from a bit of a theater world, and I always wanted there to be something separating the camera from the action, like we shot, you know, frame in a frame. So you're peering past something until you get to those moments where, you know, it's all close-ups. And my amazing cinematographer, Bruce Theory Chung, helped me develop this visual language. We worked together to make these kind of ground rules that we would use. And that was one of them. You know, the camera's never as close to the people as they feel with each other. And I just used that, and looking at ways to, also I just didn't feel like I needed it. I knew I was going to edit the film. I'd never done that before, but I kind of knew in my head, oh, well, I'll never cut in here or do this. I just want to sit with it. So I wanted to be judicious with my time, but also I enjoyed it, and I wasn't afraid to take a few risks and not discredit the audience's ability to sit with it. And
I think it compounds their proximity, their closeness in the later stages of the film. It just adds more weight to the importance of what that connection feels like, looks like.
Yeah, that's what we talked about a lot, is like, you know, how long is it before, you know, they actually physically touch, and when they are together, and being able to somehow like withhold that as long as possible kind of builds that tension in a way to make that payoff, you know, important.
At what juncture did you know that you'd be playing Sarah? Was it always something that you had conceived from the get-go?
Kinda. when I first outlined it, I had an outline, and the story was a bit more ensemble-y, multi-layered in certain ways, and I'd outlined it that, and I thought that my role would be a bit more passive. It may be more of his story leading it a little bit and things, but then as I sat down and started writing, you know, it kind of came out, which actually, if you kind of watch the beginning few scenes of the film, Sarah's character doesn't say much and is kind of put back, and I think that's kind of holdover from like the first way I thought, like, oh, this should be, you know, more of a passive thing. But then as I started writing and started realizing, like, if I'm going to tell this very honest story, I just need to be honest with the character I'll play and just tell that story and not be afraid to, not, you know, just tell his or the ensembles, like, you know, be as vulnerable as you're going to ask those people around you. So I just went for it. So I was like, okay, this is Sarah's journey, and I wanted it to be about a relationship. I didn't want it to be an empowering thing where the way a woman got clarity in life is by confronting an old love or a flame. Like, no, this is about a relationship.
Yeah, there's no big eureka moment.
No, I mean, these are adults, you know.
Yes.
These are adult people, and we wanted to look like adults, feel like adults, and act like adults.
I was shocked to learn, again, from the Q&A, that you cited one specific documentary film reference, and upon further reflection, it makes total sense. I was wondering if you can unveil what that doc film was.
It was, I mean, this film is just like sat with me like every day of my life, and I just think about it, and I thought about it every day prepping this movie. It was The Octopus Teacher. And there are even little, you know, Easter eggs in the film about the octopus.
Little winks, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
There's little winks to it. But it would be a frame of that was one film that Clayne and I talked a lot about. As, you know, who in the moment's the diver, who's the octopus, when does the diver and the octopus actually touch each other? How does that feel? What is that pursuit like? And feeling that emotion between those two characters is very parallel to Sarah and Joseph. And so I used that, and also just the idea of, like, you know, with the octopus, this man had to go very deep in the ocean and, you know, make a lot of effort to find and figure this out and confront this thing. And same thing with Joseph, but also same thing with Sarah's, you know, that octopus developed trust, and that was a big thing with her, is, you know, she always felt safe with him until the moment she didn't trust him, and kind of rebuilding that and what that looks like. And yeah, so that was definitely very prominent in my mind and
So
life.
interesting.
And we had just these little things we could say to each other in the moment to be like, you know, octopus diver, you know, just to like reset things and help in the moment. And that was definitely a reference point.
And the title of the film is not the name of the characters, it's You and I, and that it belongs to these two individuals. That story belongs to them on different planes or different ways, and so it's a very peculiar, but also very strategic use of you know, you could have named it, I don't know, by the characters' names, but it's very deliberate, and I really like that idea.
I'm glad you noticed that, because some people, you know, say, well, you and me, because aren't you the I? And I'm like, actually, no, it's very reason, you know. I said me is an objective pronoun, and I don't want anyone to be objectified. These are like nominative names. These are people, you know, you and I, they have their own actions. One's not objectifying the other in any way. And, you know, coming from my English teachery world, that was you know, something that was important to me.
So I always stay towards the end of the credits. Lynette Howell, who produced Blue Valentine, which is both of our favorites. And I was thinking of that film before I'd seen the credits. The reason being is that the approach here is to look at a relationship through two different timelines at the same juncture, and Blue Valentine does that a lot differently, but again, it's two timelines at a same juncture. Was that one of many sources of inspiration for you?
Definitely, like Blue Valentine, I mean, such a beautiful love story, and that was definitely one that was a reference to me, in how raw and visceral and emotional it was, and how connected these two people were. And I was hoping if I can capture 1 ounce of that vulnerability, that it would be, you know, to me, a home run. And that's just a beautiful film. And I definitely appreciated the moments where even you knew they were connected, even though they were at odds with each other.
Yes.
And that there's this some je ne sais quoi, something that you just can't describe, and that's what these people had with each other, these magnetism. So it was definitely something that I thought about. My choice of the slice of life was more practical. That was one of my rules, is the story had to be contained to a certain script day so that I would have minimal wardrobe changes.
Yes.
And I wrote it specifically where Clayne and I could film our storyline in order, which was important to me just for performance and things, allowing us to take things where we wanted. So our storyline was filmed in order with, you know, it takes place over a weekend. Very few wardrobe changes and things that we did our own wardrobe, we did our own hair and makeup to keep these things kind of minimal for us.
And I'll end with this. So you are a participant at the US in Progress. You had done a panel sort of like imparting some of the knowledge and the experiences that you had. I'm always surprised by how little I know, me personally as a journalist, about all the creative energy it takes in the post-production process. And you having experienced it as a producer, but also as a filmmaker, a first-timer, what are sort of like, how do you look back at that experience here, and what surprises you about the process to this day? Like, is there anything that you can cherry pick that's of an utmost importance that you sort of like were not unaware of, but that became much more important than you originally thought?
I think the biggest surprise to me in general on this film and the making of it is that, you know, the most influential things that came to me on this film were through strangers. Clayne was a stranger to me. The people at US in Progress were strangers to me. My composer was a stranger. My sound mixer, and all these people were strangers that come to me in a very kind of organic way. And having made the film in a very insular way to kind of open up yourself that much to strangers was kind of, it was a big thing for me. And I'm glad that, you know, Clayne stayed with me through the process to help, you know, kind of maybe cheerlead, boost my confidence every once in a while, but also facilitate. You know, he introduced me to the composer, William Ron Fritsch, and then I had, but the US in Progress program really opened my eyes to the vastness of opportunity that I could have, because when I finished the film, I didn't have any money to literally finish it. So coming here was instrumental in finishing post-production. I did my color correction here and some visual effects, helped me make my DCPs and things. But then also when it come to time, like, oh, I'm doing this in Poland, why don't I think like worldly to do other things? So that's what led me. I did my sound in Mexico with Javier and Perez and in Mexico City, and that was just like amazing. So I think it was something about, you make something so personal, so intimate, so small from a very specific place, and you think you're just a small person in this big industry, and you're definitely a quiet voice. And you know, I made a movie about a woman that doesn't feel seen, and you know, people around saw you and believed in it, and that was just helpful to me. And all those people had a lot of experience I could rely on. Like, I knew what to do, I knew the order of operations, but like to be in it is very different. So I'm glad too, part of me making this film was to, you know, be a more empathetic producer too. I pride myself on being like a creative producer, and
I'm so glad to have finally met you in person. So the film now is, you're submitting to film festivals internationally, nationally. So essentially, you got another half year, full year ahead of doing this stuff. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Summer. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, this is Eric from IONCINEMA.com. If you want to support us, subscribe below. For more reviews, interviews, film festival coverage from Sundance, Cannes, Toronto, you want to check out these guys on this side.